The main focus of this topic is going to be understanding short-run economic fluctuations. Before we dive into these notes, I want to just start by showing you some data about economic fluctuations. So here I've gone to Fred and I've just pulled up real GDP for the United States. You can see that on average, GDP is growing over time, right? That's what we want in terms of long-run economic growth. And that's what we're talking about when we describe the production function in the last video. What factors affect how a country grows over the long term? But when we look at this picture of long-run real GDP growth, it actually masks a lot of what's going on in the economy in the short term. So if instead of looking at this picture where GDP is growing at a rate of, say, 3% per year, I look at the percent change in GDP over time, you can see that there are a lot of really big fluctuations in the growth rate of GDP. So perhaps on average, GDP grows at 3% per year, but at some points in time here, we have GDP growing in excess of 7%. And we also have big drops in GDP, a contraction in the economy where GDP is shrinking year to year. In those situations, we say we have a recession. Remember, recession is defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth. So you can see that as this GDP growth rate drops below that 0 line, you'll notice that the gray bars on the graph represent periods of economic recession. All right, so here we have short-term business cycle fluctuations. This picture is showing me long-run economic growth. That's great, but what about short-term business cycle fluctuations? The government has an interest in trying to reduce short-term business cycle fluctuations because we would prefer to grow at a steady 3% per year than to have wild swings in our economy, growing sometimes 7%, sometimes shrinking, where we have unemployment and underutilized resources in our economy. So the government tries to minimize these short-term business cycle fluctuations to make them smaller, to have a more slow, steady growth rate of, say, 2 or 3% per year. All right, so short-term business cycle fluctuations, hopefully now you understand, looking at the data, what I'm talking about when I say business cycle fluctuations. And we're going to go back to our guided notes to start to talk just a little bit about how we might begin to conceptualize those fluctuations in the economy. All right, so what do we know about short-term business cycle fluctuations? Well, we know that they happen, right? Because we can see in the data that we have these ups and downs and swings around our long-run economic growth rate, okay? And we know that they are irregular and unpredictable. A lot of people spend a lot of time wondering what's going to happen in the economy in the future, but so far we don't have a good way to predict when another recession will occur, how long a recession will last, or whether an expansion will continue. We have guesses, we look at data, but in some sense, each economic business cycle is a bit different. The last recession driven by a housing crisis due to misinformation in financial markets, this recession due to a public health crisis, right? And so to the extent that those big events are somewhat unpredictable, recession and expansion is also unpredictable. We know also that our macroeconomic indicators tend to move together. okay? And that these indicators, right, GDP, unemployment, inflation, it have sometimes predictable relationships, like with GDP and unemployment, right? GDP goes up, unemployment goes down. We have a recession, GDP shrinks, unemployment increases. But sometimes a little bit less predictable, like inflation tends to increase in expansions and decrease in contractions, but it's not as strong of a relationship as GDP and unemployment. But all of our macroeconomic indicators, for the most part, tend to be affected by these business cycle fluctuations and tend to move together. So the last one here is that there is an especially strong relationship between unemployment and output, like I just mentioned, right? GDP and unemployment have a pretty strong relationship. I know that if we're in an expansion, unemployment is going down, and if we're in a contraction, unemployment is going up. And we've talked about that already when we talked about cyclical unemployment. All right, so we can use this relationship between output and unemployment to help us think about how big of a recession we're having. Now is actually a really good time to be talking about this because we are in the beginnings of a recession, in the middle of a recession. I don't know how long it's going to last, right? And we don't have data about that yet, right? I don't have any GDP numbers for the first quarter of 2020. Those will be released actually this week on the 24th. So perhaps some of you are watching this video after those have been released. But regardless, before we're in a recession, we need 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. So we won't even know if we are having a recession right now for several months, right? Until like July. So we don't know what the output gap is right now, okay? And I'll define that in a second. But we do have more up-to-date statistics about unemployment. And in this moment where policymakers are trying to decide how big of a stimulus package to pass, right? What type of monetary policy to adopt, it's really important that we just use whatever data we have available to us. And so Okuns law, which we're going to talk about here next, is a useful tool for policymakers in times when we don't have all of the information. And this is not a law. I actually hate that it's called a law because it's not written in stone. It's a rule of thumb. It's debatable. There's just not a lot that you're going to put stock in that exact number that you get based on this calculation, but it does give you a ballpark range for understanding what's going on in the economy. Okay, so let's get to it. Okay, when we're in a recession, we're thinking that our output here is below potential output, right? So we have some long run potential output, and it's really important that you start to think about business cycle fluctuations in this way. Oops, I don't know what just happened. Okay, potential output, long run potential output. Okay, that's growing at say 3% per year. But sometimes output dips below the long run rate of output, and we have a positive output gap. And sometimes when the economy is growing like crazy, we're producing at a rate that's above the long run sustainable rate of production. And in those time periods, we would say that we have a negative output gap. We're producing more than we can sustain in the long run. All right. So our output gap is the difference between potential long run potential output and our actual output. And you can see now, right, that that's going to be positive during times of recession and negative during times of expansion. And we want to think about, during this recession, how big is our output gap? And then we can start to talk about if the government can do something to try to fill in the gap in order to lessen the severity of the recession. So first question then is, how big is the output gap? And we have this Okuns law kind of rule of thumb, really rough estimate for calculating our output gap, or how much below potential output we're operating. So for every percentage point in cyclical unemployment, we would expect to see a 2% increase in the output gap, 2 percentage point increase in the output gap, okay? So let's go through an example to see how this would work. This is from the last recession. Here in 2011, we had unemployment at 9%. The top for the last recession was 10%. I'm sure we will be exceeding that this month. Okay. So here we have 9% unemployment rate and 6% natural unemployment rate. I don't know if we talked about this very much in the last, in topic 14, but we can calculate our long run natural unemployment rate by looking at the rate at which people quit their job and the rate at which people are being fired, right? That's kind of our frictional unemployment, where people are changing jobs, shifting in and out of jobs, and that type of unemployment is natural and healthy for our labor markets. So what we want to look at when we're looking at cyclical unemployment here is the difference between our actual unemployment rate during a recession and what we would consider the natural rate of unemployment. And so here, this is like a really easy calculation, right? We would estimate that cyclical unemployment is about 3%, 3 percentage points of cyclical unemployment. All right, so now how do we calculate our output gap? Our output gap is going to be 2 times our cyclical unemployment, so that gives me a 6% output gap. That means that the economy was perhaps operating at a level that was 6% below potential output, okay? And if we know that real GDP at that time period was about $15 trillion, right, then we can back out the size in dollars of the output gap. How much are we missing from our long-run growth potential? Again, I just want to emphasize that this is a very rough estimate, okay? And it's something that can be debated, but at this point in time right now, when you're hearing people talk about estimates of how much we're losing in terms of overall production or decline in GDP, okay, they're maybe not using exactly Okuns rule, but they're using something similar to this. We are all interested in how bad is it right now? That's the first question we have when we enter a recession. And so we have some ways of trying to estimate how bad it is before we have all the data. Of course, in hindsight, 2 years from now, we'll look back and we'll know a lot more than we do at this point in time, but it will be too late to take any action to reduce the business cycle fluctuation. Okay, good. So that's a little kind of overview of what we know about short-run fluctuations. In the coming videos, what we're going to do is develop a model to describe why short-run fluctuations occur. And then we're going to use that model to help us conceptualize how to respond in terms of both monetary and fiscal policy.